Let's talk about what affects heat balance during running. This is part 2 of chapter 4 of the law of running. And we're going to talk about how to influence heat balance. So clearly running in a penguin suit does something to being hot, or running in hot environments, or something about exercise intensity too. So let's look at exercise intensity. How does exercise intensity influence heat balance? Remember, heat balance, you're trying to get rid of heat if you're generating heat, or retain it if you're in a cold environment. So I've got a graph here, calories per hour, and calories is just a unit of heat. So this is heat per hour. And on the x-axis is intensity of exercise. So easy, hard. As we exercise harder and harder, as we run faster and faster, as our bike resistance gets greater and greater, as we swim faster and faster, the amount of heat produced goes up. The amount of heat produced goes up. The amount of heat lost also goes up as we exercise, but there's a gap between the amount of heat lost and the amount of heat production in general. Okay, again, it depends on the bias is hot environments. If we're in a cold environment, maybe this would look different. But that gap is going to be influenced by lots of different things. One, how well we can get rid of the heat from a body mechanism, or what the environment is like. So this dotted line represents heat loss, and this says total here. So total heat loss. And here, this is evaporative loss. Okay, this would be sweat rate. So as we exercise harder, we sweat more. I'm telling you something you already know. As we exercise harder, we also lose some heat to respiration. We're breathing deeper and faster. And so the more we exhale, we actually get rid of some heat there. Again, my bias is exercise in a hot environment, and I'm interested in heat loss mechanisms. Unless I'm dealing with swimming, then we're looking at heat gain or retaining. All right, so the bottom line is, in general, the heat production is greater than heat loss as intensities increase. This gap between this dotted line and this line right here gets bigger and bigger as exercise intensity goes up. So let's talk about factors that influence that heat loss. Well, wind influences heat loss, and that allows for convection. Here in Las Vegas, we know that. We know that if the wind is blowing on us, we can be a little bit cooler. That's because of convection, as long as the air temperature is less than body temperature. Or what's very common to do in exercise in a hot environment is you pour water on you, and then the wind comes along and whisks that water off you, and that keeps you cool. So convection. Now you must consider relative wind speed. This is a problem that if you're biking and you have a tailwind, your relative wind speed may be quite low, or maybe none. And therefore you do not get a cooling effect of the wind when you're biking with a tailwind. But if you're going into headwind, you get more of a cooling effect. High temperatures obviously affect heat balance. If exercise is in an environment equal to or greater than body temperature, heat cannot be lost through convection. You can't, because heat is always going to go from hot to cold. And if the air temperature is hotter than body temperature, we've got a problem. We can't have heat going from the body. In fact, we can have heat gained from the environment at that point. Sweating is an important mechanism of heat loss in hot environments. If humidity is high, however, sweat does not vaporize, but it drips off the body, and it does not produce that cooling effect. The important thing of sweating is the evaporation. So we've got to be really careful in hot environments, and we've got to be really super careful in hot and humid environments. Las Vegas is not humid. We may have a humid day here, and that may be 20%, but that's really not that humid. Back east in Long Island, we used to race where it would be 95 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and we would have 95% humidity. That's hot and humid. Same thing in Hawaii. You've got hot and humid temperatures there. And so the mechanism that you're going to employ to try to keep the body cool may be different than if you're exercising in a hot and dry environment or a cooler environment. Heat is always going to go from hot to cold. All right, here's just a couple of graphs here. I've got sweat rate here on the y-axis, exercise time on the x-axis. Another factor that influences heat loss or heat balance is the time that we're exercising and the environment. So here I've got a hot, humid environment. I've got a cool environment. Again, I'm telling you things you already know. If you're in a hot environment, you are going to sweat more and faster than if you're in a cool environment. Your sweat rate will change based upon the environment. And so this is important. We'll talk about sweat rate in a little bit. And it is important for athletes to know what their sweat rate is. Well, the athlete needs to know how environment influences that sweat rate. So if I'm training here in Las Vegas for a race in Norway, which is going to be cool, the sweat rate that I calculate here in Las Vegas on a hot day has nothing to do with the sweat rate that I'll have in Norway. So we have to really pay attention to that. And therefore, we'll ultimately, and this is what we'll talk about down the road, we'll have to adjust our hydration plan based upon what our sweat rate is. All right, the other graph I have here is core temperature. And we can have a rise in core temperature in a hot, humid environment, and that rise can be faster than what happens in a cool environment. Right? And again, this depends on how cold, how hot and humid, but in general, we run the risk of running higher core temperatures in exercise in hot and humid environments versus cool environments. That's because it's a little easy for, well, sorry, let me say it that way. It is easier to add layers of clothing to stay warm in cool environments, but in hot and humid environments, you're really limited in some of the strategies to stay cool. And sometimes that strategy is stop exercising or slow down and then don't generate as much heat internally. So factors that affect heat balance, low temperatures. The concern in low temp environments is when the rate of heat loss exceeds the rate of heat production. Hypothermia is low body temperature. The body is better designed to lose heat energy versus retain heat. And clothing is important. Now, I am interested in cooler temperatures when I'm dealing with swimming and triathlon. That's partly why we wear a wetsuit. A wetsuit is designed to keep the swimmer warmer. And that happens by having a layer of water go inside the wetsuit, and the body heats up that layer of water. And that ends up being a insulation between the cold water and the surface of the skin. And therefore, you're able to stay warmer in a wetsuit. So I am interested in maintaining core temperature during swimming in cold water. Or in cold environments, if you go up to Mount Charleston, you've got to wear clothing in a way to retain whatever heat you're able to generate. Cloud cover influences heat balance. The amount of radiant energy which the athlete is exposed to is at greatest when there's no cloud cover. Again, this is something we know in Las Vegas. You can always tell someone who's from Vegas is that when you're standing across the street, you stand in the shade of the light pole, the traffic pole there. You do that because you are reducing the amount of radiant solar energy you're getting by the shadow of the pole. Exercising with clouds is much different than exercising in direct sun. Clothing can be an insulator. This is where it will trap a layer of air between skin and clothing, just like a wetsuit will. Air is a poor conductor of heat, and therefore it serves as a good insulator. So so part of what you're doing when you're layering your clothes for cold temperatures is you're trying to trap that air inside the clothing, between you and the clothing fabric. So you want to wear sufficient clothing to keep warm, but not so much that you start to sweat. So insulating properties of clothing are generally lost when they become wet, either with sweat or with rain. The clothing properties will change. Now, clothing can also help promote heat loss. but it needs to do that in a way that does not interfere with the evaporative process of sweat. So wearing things like mesh singlets or breathable fabric for shorts and shirts is one way to do it. There's different companies that are trying different chemical polymers on fabric to try to promote that heat loss from the body. And that's still in an early stage. Um, so you'll see athletes in triathlon wear tri-suits, and these suits are designed to try to either retain heat, depending on what type of material you're using, or to let um, your core temperature, let the body lose heat. So this is classic in the 80s. 90s, people wore a lot of singlets and shorts during triathlon, so they would change out their bike gear and put on running specific clothing. This is more common for athletes to wear is something like this. It's more of a what we would call a full sleeve. It's not really full; it only goes to the elbow, but you're trying to minimize the direct exposure skin has to the sun, to the radiant energy. And this company is also who is trying some different polymers and different types of fabric to promote that heat loss. So this is a suit that you would wear in a hot environment. This is another type of suit. It doesn't have the arms on here, so it's just a different type of strategy to try to stay cool. And there's all different other fabrics and styles and different types of panels to promote heat loss or to retain heat, depending on what environment you're in. I have a specific outfit that I wear in cold environments, and I have another one that's for hot environments. All right, other factors that affect heat balance. Well, you can get used to the heat. So heat acclimatization. So performance can be impaired if the athlete is not acclimatized to the heat. Heat acclimatization begins after the first exposure and fully developed in about 1 to 2 weeks. The optimum acclimatization program is to exercise daily in intensities greater than 50% VO2 max. Now, there's lots of individual variability. We all adapt to the heat differently. Some of us take years getting used to the heat here in Las Vegas. But heat acclimatization, if you're going to be going to a hot environment, this is an issue usually for people going to Kona to race. The top athletes will get there anywhere from 2 weeks to maybe even a month before the event in order to acclimatize themselves to the heat. Acclimatization is characterized by an earlier onset of sweating, so that's a cooling mechanism, an increase in the sweat capacity, that is how much you can actually sweat, and the sweat rate, and reduced losses of sodium and chloride. Those are important electrolytes for muscle contraction to happen. Heat acclimatization is retained for a few days up until about a week after returning to cooler environments, complete loss in about a month, 28 days. Athletes who cannot acclimatize to the exact environment, what they will typically do is go to a sauna. If they know they have in a race like Kona in a hot and humid environment, they will try to get some acclimatization by going to a sauna and spending time in a sauna in order to expose the body to high temperatures. And there is some evidence that doing that, even if you're in Wisconsin, you can do some sauna acclimatization work and then have a better chance of being successful in a hot race like Kona. So acclimatization does not need to be at the specific environment. That's nice if it can be, but it doesn't have to be. Okay, let's talk dehydration. This is a term that's used a lot in the exercise world. People typically want to try to prevent dehydration, and in general, that's true. But we're gonna look at this a little differently than maybe a commercial or infomercial. So dehydration is loss of fluid from the body due to sweating, vomiting, diarrhea, or even urinary fluid loss. And that's important to know, especially during an endurance event, because you can have a lot of vomiting. An athlete can have diarrhea and also go to the bathroom a lot. So these are other issues. It's not just sweat that will influence dehydration. Ingestion of water during exercise enhances the ability to sustain the same exercise intensity for longer duration. Plenty of evidence supporting this. Now, if you include carbohydrate in the drink, that's better than water alone. That prevents hypoglycemia, which we talked about in the previous chapter, but there's also a possible placebo effect of having carbohydrate in the hydration. All right, so plenty of evidence that drinking water is good, okay? Fluid ingestion decreases the perception of effort. Fluid ingestion ad libitum is as beneficial as higher rates of forced ingestion. All right, so in this chapter, Noakes really starts to talk about how much to drink. Ad libitum is a strategy for drinking. Ad libitum means drink whenever you want. Drink when you feel you need to drink, okay? Other mechanisms, hydration strategies are to drink every 15 minutes, every 20 minutes, maybe sip every 5 minutes. But that's a strategy in terms of drinking. Forced ingestion is something a little bit different. That's where you're forcing fluid in probably beyond what your body needs or is capable of processing. So drinking a liter, every 10 minutes, that's forced ingestion. Okay. But what Noakes does advocate is ad libitum strategy is probably just as good as a sipping strategy, or just as good as drinking every 10 minutes. There's lots of debate on that. And personally, I fall a little bit in between. Sometimes I need to drink based upon thirst, especially in a hot environment where your mouth gets very dry. And but at the same time, it's good to have a plan. I want to go through a water bottle every hour in a hot environment. I want to go through a bottle and a half, depending on the environment. So I try to have a target of fluid to get through in a particular time period in a particular environment. So is dehydration a cause of fatigue? That we talk about this a lot. We hear this a lot. I was dehydrated, I slowed down. Noakes reviewed some of the early work in dehydration in this chapter and really go through it. It's really important. Here's some summary points. Even when given free access to adequate fluid, subjects drank less than they lost in sweat or urine. Progressive dehydration was associated with premature fatigue. Subjects stopped exercise when they lost about 7 to 10% body weight. Dehydration did not reduce sweat or urine rate during exercise. Rectal temperature, core temperature, and heart rate rose linearly with level of dehydration. There were no immediate health risks associated with levels of dehydration of 7 to 10%, only at high levels of dehydration, 15 to 20%. Was there a risk of serious organ failure. All right, so those are some summary points that he goes through. These are really important to understand. So he's not saying dehydration is not bad, but what he is saying in this chapter is dehydration is probably not as big of a factor as what we think it is, or what we may promote it is, or what drink manufacturers may promote. All right, so let's talk about how much body weight we're losing. 7 to 10%, 10% your body weight. I'm 180 pounds. That's 18 pounds. 18 pounds of loss of fluids for 7 to 10. That's a lot of weight to lose. Now, I weigh myself before exercise. I weigh myself after exercise. I can lose a tremendous amount of weight on a hot day, but not 18 pounds. That's a lot of loss of fluid. 15 to 20% of loss of weight, that's where we're really worried about organ failure. 20% weight loss for me, that's 36 pounds. I'd get on the scale and I'd be 144 pounds, where I'm normally 180 pounds. That's a problem, okay? There's a risk associated with that amount of weight loss. Now, interestingly, there have been a few races along the history of triathlon where they have actually forced people to stop exercising and weigh themselves. Hawaii Ironman did this. And the reason for that was they were trying to minimize the risk athletes were exposing themselves to by weighing themselves. It's not that common to do this. However, when you check into a race, you weigh yourself at an Ironman, and if you do end up in the med tent, they will weigh you as well in order to get a sense of what level of dehydration you're at. But 7 to 10% and 20% body weight, those seem like small numbers, but those are big numbers, big losses of weight. So ingestion of fluid, prolonged exercise, that's good. The impact of dehydration, you stopped exercises or exercising in the studies that Noakes reviewed, all right? Several studies demonstrated that endurance athletes lost weight during competition. So there is a sense of voluntary dehydration that happens during a race. In fact, top finishers were dehydrated and had high core temperature, high rectal temperature. But there are no dangers to those athletes who are dehydrated. Two interpretations. Fluid intake should be promoted to prevent dehydration, prevent heat stroke, failure of the heat regulating mechanism of the body. You don't want heat stroke. But the other interpretation, this is really interesting to think of it this way. To be a top endurance athlete, you may need to be able to tolerate levels of dehydration. You may need to be able to tolerate rises in core temperature in order to be a top athlete. All right, let's keep going here. There's no empirical evidence that endurance performance will be optimized if fluid ingested at the same rate is ingested at the same rate that it's lost during exercise. So if I go out and exercise and I start at 180 pounds, I don't drink anything, and I come back and I'm 174 pounds, right? What Noakes is saying here is maybe the next time I go out and I drink 6 pounds of fluid so that I end up at 180 pounds again, okay? That's drinking the amount of weight that you lose due to sweating. In this case, that would be sweating. So interestingly, McConnell and colleagues reported that replacing 100% sweat lost during exercise did not improve performance more so than replacing 50% of that loss. So drink half. So if I lost 6 pounds, maybe I only need to drink 3 pounds of water, and I'm not going to have any impairment of performance. Exercise in the heat is limited by rising core body temperature. That's what's limiting exercise in the heat. Ingesting fluid is an important mechanism to keep the body temperature controlled. There may be a trade-off to ingesting too much fluid, for example, hyponatremia, which I'll go through in just a bit, excess weight, and gastrointestinal problems, GI problems. Excess weight, if I just drink the water and I'm carrying that extra weight around, that's not helping me run faster. That's not helping me bike faster. I got to carry that weight. GI problems is very common if we drink too much. And hyponatremia is a problem if we take in too much fluid and we dilute the body so that we don't have enough sodium. And then sodium is very critical for maintaining electrical signals and muscle activity. All right, so the real problem is not dehydration. The real problem is heat balance. The real problem is maintaining core temperature. And if you're in a hot environment, sweat is a key component to maintaining core temperature. You need to continue to drink to hydrate yourself in a way that the sweating mechanism is allowed to do what it does. We don't go around and saying that dehydration is the problem. We say rising core temperature is the problem, and we need to stay cool. So we not staying warm in a cold environment or not being able to get rid of excess heat in a hot environment. That's really what I'm focusing on. All right, so how do we prevent heat balance from negatively influence performance? That's emphasis in the next section is on fluid ingestion. So summarizing part 2, heat balance, heat is created by the body via muscle contraction. Environment adds to heat balance. Temperature, humidity, either temperature is greater than or colder than body temperature. Sweat is an important mechanism in hot environments to maintain core temperature. core temperature is really the critical feature here influencing endurance performance. And dehydration is really related to an impairment of the sweat process to stay cool. Okay, thank you.